Hello and welcome. What I want to do in this screencast today is introduce you to some tips and tricks for how to read a textbook or an article or any type of formal literature or research effectively to improve your brain's ability to absorb the information so you have it to use later, whether that is in an application strategy, an exam, a paper, or a presentation. Your ability to read and to remember what you've read is absolutely crucial if you are a student and is definitely helpful as you go through your professional careers. So, what we're going to start off today is with an article by Cuesta College, and I tend to include this in most of my classes. However, if you're just accessing this on YouTube, I wanted to include the URL at the top of the screen here. You can just Google Cuesta College, how to read a textbook, and it'll be one of the first things you click on. And what this article does is it builds on an original reading strategy that was called SQ3R back in the day whenever I was a student, but it has been updated to SQ4R, which basically means there are multiple steps that you need to take, a 6-step process every time you read something that you want to recall later. If it is pleasure or leisure reading and you're just filling time, you don't have to be that intense about it. But if you are reading something that you have to be tested on later or utilize or incorporate or write about, this is an excellent method to help you. I'm not going to spend a great amount of time on this article because you can read it on your own, but what I wanted to do is just show you where this resource was, and then I'm going to move into some of my own personal note-taking skills so you can see how I actually read when I'm reading something formal or important, so you can see that I'm applying this too. Now, the SQ4R process is survey, question, read, recite, record, review. It used to be read, recite, review, but that record is the new extra step where we implement a little bit more about note taking. So essentially, whenever you want to read something for recall, you want to start off by just looking over whatever it is you're reading, whether it's a chapter or an article. Just flip through it and look at some of the titles and the headings. See if any of the bold or italicized words, if it's a textbook, are standing out to you because you're just activating your brain. It's something that you do like warming up before a workout. You're warming up your brain to give it something to pay attention to as you go. It helps you access your prior knowledge and it helps activate the different areas of your brain that are going to start building those recall connectors. Before you start reading, if a chapter survey or overview is provided, even if it's something as simple as a chapter table of contents, scan through that just to see if you can see any themes or relatable items. And then to move on, as you begin to read and before, you can write out questions about the content. If you're reading about something you've never heard of before, it's okay to write down in your notes somewhere, I have no idea what this is. What is this talking about? And then see if you can answer that question by the time you finished reading that section or article. Coming up with your own questions is a higher level critical thinking skill that allows you to truthfully utilize your brain's potential. So, after you've surveyed and kind of scanned the chapter and come up with some questions to think about before you get into it, you can finally start reading. And while you're reading, as it says, take minimal notes. I call these internal summaries. That's a speech teacher phrase. And this is when we kind of summarize paragraphs and sections as we go. When you recite, you're trying to make sure that you put ideas into your own words. I love the fact that Cuesta has bolded that because it is absolutely crucial. I've mentioned it before that if you want something to stick, it has to be personal. In order for something to be personal, you've had to expend the extra effort to put it into your own words. As you continue going, take more notes from the reading and then be able to review the material. Now, with reviewing the material, what you're supposed to do here is look over your notes and the headings and subheadings and the text and make sure that you have captured what you need to in the information. So, one of my favorite tactics that I was taught whenever I was growing up would be to predict the test questions based off of the major headings and subheadings in the text and the terminology. Because if you can get into the habit of predicting what will most likely be assessed, again, you're giving your brain something to hold on to to, and that truly allows you to predict an exam before it happens. Now, will we ever be 100% accurate there? Probably not. But will we be much more accurate and activated while listening and reading? Yes. So, very quick overview of that one. That's just a method that you can use. It's the method that, again, I was similarly raised with. But what I want to transition into would be how I take notes myself. Now, what I'm going to do in the next little bit is introduce you to the articles that I read voluntarily. This means something that I study because I choose to, something that I enjoy studying, and things that I do to improve my teaching as I go through. Whenever I'm reading whatever it might be, whether it's an article or a textbook, my emphasis with articles would be to have something that is comparable to the language a textbook would use. That's why I'm pulling this instead of a textbook or an ebook. So this is something that's written at the same level, if not a higher level, than a typical college textbook. So that way the structure of the information would be similar. I'm not utilizing a single textbook because sometimes that invades privacy and sharing laws. So the first tip I can give you, other than the SQ4R, is to be willing to highlight and annotate. And highlighting is exactly what it sounds like when you use a highlighter to identify certain sections of text that are useful for you to know later. You should not highlight everything, and you very often may not even highlight a full sentence. You'll see my particular highlighting approach is to get phrases, because that way I'm looking at the fewest words possible whenever I come back to it to study for an exam. The purpose of highlighting and annotating in SQ4R is to keep us from having to read an entire article word for word again, or an entire chapter in a textbook word for word again. The emphasis is to make sure that we focus on only the strongest elements that we need to remember later on, in the effort of saving us time a little bit later on as we go and get ready. Now, what I want to do after that would be to point out to you the types of notes that I do take, because highlighting is self-explanatory, but annotating is essentially note taking. It's a fancy textbook term for a note take. So annotating is when you kind of do that recite and review process from the SQ4R, where you start incorporating notes while you're reading. So the first time that I read an article, I go through and I highlight key phrases. Again, you can look here and see that I'm not highlighting everything. I'm just highlighting terminology that tells me what that section is about. And I'm in the abstract right now, which is essentially an overview of an article. So the introduction kicks in down here, and so will my notes. You're absolutely welcome to judge my handwriting. That is not what I am here for. So as I read through here, I highlight any key abbreviations, names, or terms, what I consider to be the thesis of the situation, any new terms like ultraversity as opposed to university. That seems interesting. And you'll see here that I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because those are like the 5 key concepts of what this article wants to address. I always number everything when I am reading. If it's in a list in a sentence that's got comma, comma, comma in there, I number the commas, because very often an instructor will say, what were the 5 approaches developed over the past 7 years from your article on distance learning? And if I've already got this numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then I know where to look. I have studied it, and I'm already giving myself that clue for later. If you need a mental image for note taking and highlighting while you read a text, I want you to think of a mountain climber attempting to get up a cliff. You have to have something, you have to have nooks and crannies for your fingers and toes and elbows and knees to get into in order for you to scale that cliff. Your highlighting and your annotating is what creates those nooks and those crannies, those little places for your brain to grip onto information. I don't want to have to climb up the entire cliff again. I only want to go up the path that gets me up the mountain the fastest and most efficient way. And I'm building myself those little toe holds and finger holds every time I choose what to highlight and number and what I choose not to. So you can see here, this is my summary of their introduction. They've got all these 5 different concepts, but in summary, this section is just saying that distance learning is about practical application. That's what this is here for. So when you can, make that a little bit easier on yourself. I'm going to zoom out just a little bit. So next thing, you can see lots of highlighting. It's not particularly pretty, but I'm not here to be pretty. I am here to get the information that I need to. Again, I'm highlighting key phrases, not entire sentences, going through the information that I think is useful, and then I'm giving myself notes on the side. For example, one of my notes is saying that the way to improve online education is to wrap school around your life, not your life around school. So making sure everything is in its place. One of the emphasis here is that higher education needs to pivot. What that means is higher education needs to adapt in order to make sure that its priorities match its students' priorities as well. If a student has school first, life second, then the school can do that. But right now, as I said a minute ago, life is first and school is second, and schools need to get on board with that. So that's a note worth mentioning. Continuing through here, whenever I have a pronoun like they, I need to know who they are. I need to know to whom does this refer. So I have a little connector there so that whenever I read the word they, I know that the author is referring to students. And then again, here's my summary. Students need flexibility in application of learning and teaching methods. So moving on. This category here is about student needs, so I gave it a heading. It didn't have one, but I felt like it needed one, so I gave it its own heading. That way, if I was studying for an exam on this article and I'm sitting here thinking about, okay, what are the top 10 student needs? Okay, bam, I've given myself a subheading that I can go back and find. Again, emancipatory, I love this one. Here's another tip, aside from highlighting and annotating, is don't be afraid of looking up definitions and pronunciations of words. Unfortunately, we live in a society that apparently is scared not to know things, but the whole point of life is we don't know very much of anything and we grow as we go. So every time that you encounter a vocabulary word that either you don't know the meaning of or you do know the meaning of, but not in this context, go ahead and write out what the definition of it is. Now, I know that emancipatory means to free something. Like when people are emancipated, it means they are freed. However, how would that have anything to do with higher education course context? So I just gave myself a reminder that it's talking about developing a course setup that is freeing for the student as opposed to captivating. And then I come over here and I'm talking about collaborating to make sure that life is first and school is second. And then again, students are the creators. I'm creating that connection so that when I read the word creator, I know that's talking about students. Learning is social. The teacher and student have to have a connection in order to develop the curriculum well. So as you can see, I am very busy on this page. So if I zoom out a little bit more, that's what an average page looks like to me when I read a textbook or an article. There's a good amount of highlighting, not everything, but it's busy, and I give myself visual cues to tell me what's important, and I have constant subheadings, definitions of terminology, and summaries of each situation. So that way, when I go back through here to study this, I'm not having to relearn the whole article. I'm looking for my own clues that I've left. So to move on, there are some charts here. Sometimes I have notes on charts and sometimes I don't. That's up to you. Generally, charts are a really great way to look for a summary of an article. So my summary for this entire section here was to say that the onus, which means responsibility, is on the students to take the guidance from the learning objectives and then build a plan to get them there. So this is talking about a course setup where the student actually determines their own learning path. So that's what the summary was there. Another thing would always be to underline, circle, or highlight terms where you're going to have a first, second, third, fourth. That again helps your brain remember that there's more than one piece of information related to that topic. If I have something that I feel is a problem, that difficult doesn't even have to mean anything other than something to me. I might find that particular area of the article is difficult to understand or that it's difficult to utilize and build. Um, Again, here, one of the things here is support and encouragement students can offer each other. That's the point of a learning community, and that's a program I used to be in charge of. So, again, like I'm making personal connections. So, what we should know by now is that we're highlighting, we're taking notes, we're providing internal summaries, we're not afraid to put definitions in the work, and we do make personal connections wherever we can. I wrote this learning community note in here because that's my teaching background, so it makes a personal connection. It's giving my brain another nook to stick my fingers into. Now, the next thing I want you to be really comfortable with doing is asking questions of the articles. You can see here that I have a couple of questions here because I'm not entirely certain what this phrase meant, because it said assessment through patchwork media. Patchwork media had not been mentioned anywhere else in this article, so I stopped right there and formed a couple of predictions or questions on what I thought patchwork media was. You are constantly going to encounter information that you do not know what they're referring to, and it's your job to hit the pause button and go over it in your brain and sit there and try to find some connections before you go any further. Now, as I went through the article, I did find what patchwork media was, and so I drew my arrow to connect myself to that definition. And if you'll notice here, I predicted that it was multiple forms of technology, and it essentially was a choice of a range of media. So it was a very similar prediction. Here are little side notes for myself. Here I'm summarizing again, keeping school affordable, moving through here, numbering again because there are multiple purposes here. There are two different goals they want to achieve. This was a really cool quote that I like, so I put brackets around it to use for later. This particular section is about the challenges with the framework that these authors are proposing. So I circled the word challenges and then put it out there on the margin. So that way, if I'm studying or I have that horrible essay question saying, what would be the challenges to adapting a student led framework? Then I can come through here and go, okay, challenges, there it is. I don't have to read the whole article. I've given myself that subheading to bring me back. Again, down here was an abbreviation that I wasn't sure what they meant, so I went back and included the definition to that abbreviation to make sure that my thought process was on tap. Speaking of thought processes, I defined what the thought processes should be when they're talking about thinking here, and it's about rethinking course design based off of supply and demand. Again, more numbers, more key items, and notes to self. So I'm just scrolling through here just to show this is truly what I do. I read this in the summer of 2020 when I was revamping my courses for fall 2020. So you can continually see that I'm asking myself questions if I'm not sure of what it means. I'm giving myself information to hold on to. I'm providing myself with questions and the locations to the answers. For example, down here, they were talking about amplifiers and attenuators. I had no idea, even with 7 years of background here, on what they meant for this particular article. So I had question marks underneath there because I didn't know what they meant. But on the next page, they provided the definitions. So I flipped back, gave myself those definitions, and gave myself the note that the definitions can be found on the next page. So you can see how interactive you really should be with the text. It's not just a scan through it and hope it sticks. It's like throwing spaghetti on a wall. I mean, it might not really work for you. So there should be the willingness to go back and forth, to ask questions, to be open to not knowing something, but making sure that you go back and fill in the blanks. You can tell I had a lot of notes on this section. So I provided myself with some guidance, some reminders, some issues, some things, anything to remind myself of what was important. Here we go, more numbers and an underlining of the numbers. More results, less damage equals viable platform. The emphasis on community. Again, I can just keep on going. Here's a word. I know what the word bias means, but not in the context of this article. So now I've given myself the definition. Next few pages are going to be tables. Again, I do not write on a lot of tables. You definitely can. It depends on the course. The visuals are exceptionally helpful, again, looking for definitions, and you can see how amplifiers and attenuators were used there. So going through here, just I'm continuing to scroll and move. This article's about over with. Yeah, it's done. So that's an example of how I would do note taking. I'm going to continue to scroll through a different article just for a minute so you can see how that one was done as well. You can see that in this article, this is a really short one. As I was going through here, I went through that abstract or that summary. This is where I'm surveying, SQ4R, surveying the article by reading that and providing myself with the summaries. Information, again, I'm putting the connections there. I'm going to zoom out on this one just a little bit because this one's a little bit more active. Again, you can see this is what I do. Here's the preview of the entire article. So I'm identifying where these different elements are. I'm asking myself questions. I'm giving myself answers. I'm identifying that there's 7 skills in this table. I'm providing myself with summaries. I am numbering the content so it's easy to find. If I think that a quote is amazing, I absolutely adore this quote. I say that. So if I was giving a presentation at a conference based off of research, I know what quote I'm using. I'm going to say that lifelong learning is a continuous, voluntary, and self motivated act to expand one's own knowledge. If you have made it this far in this screencast, you are living that quote. You are continuously, voluntarily self motivating yourself to expand your awareness and knowledge. So pat yourself on the back. It's an amazing quote. So I'm telling myself that because I'm going to use it later. And I'm going to continue just to scroll through here again, summarizing, circling, providing myself with numbers, whatever it is that I need to do. So again, that article is a little bit shorter, but I just wanted you to see how it was done before. You can see how much research they used for their article. So pretty helpful. Now, what I want to do real quick is to show you what to do when you don't have an article with these gorgeous margins. I love printing off articles because I love margin notes. They're wonderful because I have this beautiful space to give my thoughts. But if you have a book, or it's an ebook that doesn't come with note-taking tools. If you have an ebook that you haven't explored, poke around because a lot of them come with highlighting and annotation tools built into the technology. So check that out. But let's say that you have an ebook or something that's too large to print, or let's say you have a physical book, but you've rented it or you need to sell it back. So clearly you cannot sell a textbook back in this condition, absolutely covered with notes and highlighting. What you do is you take this idea of organization and you pop it into a notebook. Now, what I've done with this one is this is just a page of notes from a book that I've been studying that's on comparisons of worldviews. I've been studying comparative religions and worldviews since I was about 12 or 14 because my mother taught worldviews classes. And so I was put into those at an early age because there was nowhere else for me to go. So this is from a book where the 5th chapter was on humanism. And this was just my first page of notes on that chapter. So I wanted you to see what you can do if you don't have the ability to write on your textbook. If you don't have the ability to write on your textbook, here's how you should structure your notes. You should make sure that the chapter number is present, the chapter title is present, and the chapter page number is present. You're giving your brain every single toehold you can. So I wanted to know the definition of humanism. I told myself that it's difficult to define because it's relative, but if you'll notice, the chapter started on page 137, but by page 150, there was an actual definition, so I went back and gave myself that note. And again, this is a comparative religions book, so regardless of your own personal religious point of view, that's irrelevant. This is just a book that you can look as an example. So I have my number of thoughts and purposes and goals. I have my page numbers with important quotes. So if I have a quote, I tell myself where it was, and then I have like the speaker's name, and then I have the quote marks and the information I thought was useful. These are all headings and subheadings in that book with page numbers provided. So this is something that you can use to help yourself if you want to look into not being able to write on an actual article. So if you don't have the luxury of all this space to take notes on, and an ebook doesn't have the technology, or you don't have the ability to write on something because you've got to sell it back, then you just use this instead. You give yourself the page numbers, the headings, the subheadings, the organization, and the thoughts, and you're using the same type of note taking that you would in this article. The only difference is that it is on a piece of paper or on a Word document as opposed to the actual article itself. So, what I'm hoping you have been able to learn is that highlighting and annotating are the two crucial factors to the absorption of text or formal material. You should feel comfortable with asking questions of the text if you don't know what's happening, and you should always stop and look up the definitions of words if you don't know them. It's better to immediately get that definition and write it in there so that you know how it flows with the content. If the article defines it itself, make sure you tell yourself where that definition was so that whenever you're studying at 3 in the morning on a Sunday night, you have the ability to find it quickly. Please use summaries, and where appropriate, please add in personal connections. So I'm hoping that this screencast has been somewhat helpful for you. I really am hoping that it's been beneficial and allows you to access some note taking. And what I'm going to do is pause this recording and hope that you have an absolutely wonderful rest of your day. Email me or reach out with any note taking questions you have. I hope this crash course is going to be helpful for you. Have a good one.